On Christmas Day 2010, emergency responders walked into a flat in Newham, East London, expecting possibly a domestic dispute, maybe even a drunken injury. But what they found instead looked like the crime scene of a horror film. Water everywhere, blood smeared across walls and floors, random objects smashed, broken, scattered, almost as if the house had been fighting for its own life. In the centre of that devastation lay 15-year-old Kristy Bamu. He was motionless, brutalised, and already gone. His clothes were soaked, his body destroyed by days of torture, and standing nearby, his older sister, Magalie, and her boyfriend, Bikubi. Two people who insisted that Kristy hadn't been murdered. In their minds, this was a spiritual intervention, apparently. They claimed that the teenager had been possessed, that they were just driving out evil spirits. Because when you want an excuse for sadism, witchcraft is very convenient. The police took one look at Kristy's body and they knew instantly whatever story these two were selling wasn't even close to reality. Because this wasn't an exorcism. It wasn't religion. This was brutality disguised as superstition. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. If you are new here, I hope you're all doing so well. Welcome back to another true crime and makeup episode. Oh yeah. And just in case you are new here, my name is Anna. I am a certified yapper. One day I decided I'm gonna hop on the internet, I'm going to yap about true crime, and now I find myself doing it twice a week, every single week on a Wednesday and Sunday. So, with that being said, if true crime is your jam, I highly suggest that you subscribe, get the notification bell on because, well, like I said, I'm here for you twice a week, every single week, and it's free. Please don't forget to engage with this video in some way. A like, a comment, a share, it means the world to me, and if you could please hype the video, that would mean everything. That is if YouTube has enabled that feature again. So we'll see. Any details you need regarding me, myself and I can all be found listed down below in the description. That will give you my social media handles, Instagram, TikTok, products used on my face today, in case you're interested. But I think I've said everything I need to say. Hopefully. Possibly. So without any further rambling and any further ado, let's get into the harrowing case of Kristy Bamu. You know, it's funny, I was actually going to jump on here and explain just how tired I was, because there is a chance that I might trip up on my words, which I do every time anyway. But I have been so exhausted since the weekend. I have no idea what's going on, think I might be getting ill. Love that for me. But I am so tired that I just sat for 5 minutes having a mental breakdown, a mentee bee, because I thought my camera was broke. Because it was just a black screen, okay? So picture me nearly crying, freaking out, screaming, crying, throwing up, only to realise the lens cap was still on the camera. I mean, I'm gonna blame that on me being exhausted, but there is a chance that I am just so frickin' stupid. Although I can confirm that my microphone is plugged in, so we should be recording with sound today. Yay! What the hell, Leonte? Where's my mirror? Oh wait, I was sitting on it. Love that. Now, I think this is so important for every single case that we sit here and cover, but especially this one, to be able to understand the sheer cruelty of this case. You need to understand just how gentle the young boy was that was at the centre of this. So, Kristy Bamu, he was born in 1995 and he was born in Paris to a Congolese immigrant family. So his father was Pierre and his mother was Jacqueline. And these two parents, let me tell you, they were ride or die for their children, and I know that should be the case with every parent. Unfortunately, it's not. But Jacqueline and Pierre, they would do anything to protect their children, to look after their children. Both of them were so hardworking, they were gentle parents, and they were fiercely protective of every single one of them. Pierre and Jacqueline ensured that each of their children's birthdays were celebrated to be these huge deals. They were made to feel so special every single birthday. They insisted that their children got the best education possible, and more than that, they wanted to teach their children manners, respect, empathy, and this was something that their home would be full of. And Kristy Bamu, he absorbed every single one of these traits, everything that he was taught from his parents. He listened to, he was like a sponge, he just soaked every part of it up. Now, he was the third eldest, but I would say emotionally, he was the most sensitive. He was the most in tune with other people's feelings. And because he felt everything so strongly, he was the kind of child that just didn't want to argue with anyone, also didn't want anyone else arguing. I mean, any time there was an argument breaking out in that house, Kristy put himself in the middle, he would play the mediator, and he would try and calm everything down. He just hated conflict. It was something he never involved himself in. Now, when it came to school, Kristy was an incredible student. I mean, the teachers, they had said that he was polite beyond his years. He was described as being gentle and patient, and the kind of boy who just wants harmony, doesn't want any conflict, doesn't want any drama. His sisters had said that he was the one sibling that if you had chores to do, if you were running a bit behind, he would offer up his time and his help without even being asked. His brother Eve had said that Kristy was the calm one. He was the one that never shouted, didn't slam doors, never, ever, ever provoked anyone. His family members would note that he was someone who loved and adored football. He played it constantly. His favourite player was Cristiano Ronaldo. And when he wasn't out playing football, he would be at home with his siblings, playing video games, watching TV, having a laugh and a joke, doing anything to brighten their day or his parents' day. And anytime Kristy had a moment to himself, he really enjoyed watching music videos on YouTube. And not only that, but he loved watching like comedy skits. He'd watch them on YouTube whenever he could, and he was a bit of a jokester himself. This was a kind of boy that never had any disciplinary issues, had no behavioural issues at all. He wasn't rebellious, he wasn't aggressive, he wasn't unpredictable. He was just 15 years old, a child, and a very, very, very good-hearted one. Now, of course, Kristy thought the world of every single one of his siblings. Truly, he loved them all exactly the same. But if there was one in particular that he really, really, really looked up to, that was his sister, Magalie. Kristy viewed her as the one who was grown up, who was independent, who was making it on her own. Magalie had moved away to London, and Kristy just thought she was the coolest person ever. And of course, to Kristy, viewing his sister living in London, living what he thought was the high life, it seemed so glamorous, and it really did seem so cool to him. And Kristy admired her so much. All he ever wanted was her approval. He wanted Magalie to be proud of him, and he trusted her wholeheartedly. So when Magalie had made the call back to the family home saying that she would love for the 3 younger siblings to come and spend Christmas in her flat in London, they were ecstatic, Kristy especially. I mean, he was so excited. He was going away from Paris to London. It felt grown up, it felt independent, although he was travelling with his siblings. But this trip was all he spoke about. He spent weeks getting the perfect gifts for everyone. He wanted that Christmas to feel special. He wanted it to be full of love, full of laughter. He wanted to create amazing memories and just have the best time with his big sister, who he didn't get to see as often as he wanted. But the thing is, back home in Paris, none of the family, not the parents, not the siblings, knew that Magalie had changed since being in London. I mean, it was a stark contrast. No one realised that she had become isolated, hardened, and she was swallowed by someone else's ideology. When Kristy walked into his sister's flat, he thought it was going to be time to bond with his sister, get to hear all the stories about her amazing life in London. But instead, he had clearly walked into the deadliest trap. And I suppose to understand the role that Magalie would play in the death of Kristy Bamu, we have to go back, we have to understand who she was before she moved to London, how she was described prior to then versus who she had really turned out to be. So Magalie, she had grown up with that same upbringing, in that family with structure, warmth, love, proudness from the parents, a really, really close family unit with a very strong bond. And you'd expect that the siblings, who have all turned out the same way, you know, Kristy, his younger brother, younger sister, you would imagine that Magalie would turn out the same. But the fact is that she grew differently through that experience. She didn't absorb it the way the other siblings did. She went completely against it. And I think it's people like this who are just born wrong, who are born with that evil through their veins. And don't get me wrong, as a child, there's not exactly massive waving red flags. I mean, she grew up brutally insecure. And she wasn't outwardly shy, but it was very clear that every situation she was in, she felt like she was overshadowed constantly. In her mind, she had to fight to get the attention of others. She felt as though she just faded into the background, and that is not how Magalie wanted to be. And when it comes to talking about Magalie's time in school, again, no waving red flags. The teachers said that she was actually incredibly bright. I mean, she was inconsistent, but she was bright. She could have soared academically if she'd applied herself, but it always seemed like she was too busy chasing the approval of others. And the thing is, with Magalie, she was so desperate to feel special, but she didn't care that she was already seen as someone special to her family. That wasn't enough. She wanted external validation. And it was that sort of internal hunger for validation that doesn't just leave. It just waits for the wrong person to feed into it. Now, as she got older, it did seem as though the geographical bouncing around, you know, from Congo to Paris, from Paris to London, it did seem to disrupt her sense of identity. And obviously, it is a tough thing for immigrant children. Sometimes it can be difficult to adapt, but most of the children do. Magalie, however, she really struggled. She just could not adapt to new environments. And yet she moved herself from Paris to London off her own accord. It would later be stated that the reason Magalie wanted to move from Paris to London was so she could have a complete rebrand. You know, she just wanted to reinvent herself. And that's great, more power to you, but she was going to try and reinvent herself in the worst ways possible. Sorry, I know this has absolutely nothing to do with the case, but I just had to go and blend that liquid green eyeshadow off camera because I thought my eyelids were going to melt off. If you have sensitive eyes, sensitive eyelids, sensitive skin, that product is not for you. I will link it down below for anyone who doesn't have sensitive skin and sensitive eyes, but felt like I was going to be eyelidless after applying that. I mean, it's fine now that it's settled, so if you want to deal with the burn, I mean, fair play, but I think that will be sitting in my makeup drawer and never returning. But I've committed to the cause now, so we're going to keep going with it. So, as I was saying, Magalie, she is hoping to rebrand, you know, start a new life, new beginnings, maybe find out who she really is by herself without her family. But instead of doing eat, pray, love and soul searching, she just searches for someone she can cling on to who seems more powerful, more wise, more confident and unwavering. And this is when we would come to Eric Bikubi. So when Magalie and Eric meet, she was desperate. She was lonely, in search of validation, blah, 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 blah. And when she met Eric, who had this, you know, swagger about him, or like a really embarrassing swagger, do you know that way when some people walk and it kind of looks like they might have pooped their pants? That kind of vibe. But Magalie loved it. Couldn't get enough of it. And with his forceful personality, this filled the void that Magalie was so desperate to fill. And the shift to her family, it was almost immediate after meeting Eric. I mean, she was someone who used to always call home, would check in with the family. Suddenly, she's becoming more reserved. The calls become less frequent. And any visits they had just became completely awkward. It's like they didn't know who she was anymore. And it was very obvious that any conversation she had been softened. And I don't mean like in tone, I don't mean she was talking like this and being very soft. I mean, the actual conversation itself was soft. There wasn't much to it. There was no context. It was like she was editing herself for the radio or television. Like she was making sure that whatever she said was something that wouldn't displease Eric, Prince Eric. And although the shift was immediate, the absolute change of Magalie wasn't. It was more kind of like a slow burn, gradually happened until she just wasn't speaking to anyone. So we come to 2010 when Magalie is just completely shaped and enamoured by Eric. She at this point was mirroring his beliefs. She would defend his temper. She internalised his paranoia, and not only this, but his obsession with witchcraft would become her new obsession. And I know in these stories witchcraft is never a good thing, and I'm not saying witchcraft is bad, I'm just saying there's certain people who come across witchcraft and change it in their minds to be something else completely, to try and normalise what they're doing, when really they're just being plain evil. They give witchcraft a bad name. Great, just got eyeshadow on my jumper. And I think the most chilling part when it comes to Magalie is that it wasn't like she was just this victim of brainwashing. She would become a full-on participant in enforcing these ideas that were the very ones that imprisoned her in the first place. This woman's sense of empathy had eroded completely, and it would just be replaced with this fragile loyalty that she had to a man who weaponized her insecurity for sport. But what you need to know and what you need to understand is that with Magalie, this is exactly what made her so dangerous. She was vulnerable enough to be manipulated into being a certain way. She had all the vulnerability of someone who was easy to control, but this was paired with a deep-rooted sense of cruelty that had always been within her. Now, honestly, I'm going to jump ahead just very slightly for just a little minute, but when Eric decides that Kristy is possessed, Magalie doesn't even question it. And it's not because she actually believed that Kristy was possessed, but because Eric believed it. That was enough for her. Because pleasing him, that had become her primary function. She would laugh when her little brother cried. She would slap him when he begged for his life, and she would turn away whenever he asked for mercy. And I just want to put that in here because we need to emphasise the cruelty of this woman. She is not someone to be empathised with. She is cruel, she is calculated, and she is plain evil. And she wasn't under some kind of spell like she would try and later say. She was under her own choice, one that she made repeatedly. Eric over her own family, Eric over her own brother, and Eric over basic humanity. And now we come to the world's biggest loser, Eric, the very man who mistook his own paranoid delusions for prophecy, as so many of them do. So Eric, he was born in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and his early life was marked with great instability. This was a very volatile environment where hardship was normal and any trust in people was scarce. So when he arrived in the UK as a teenager, he didn't arrive with a clean slate. Instead, he had carried over this tightly wound up ball of complete resentment. Not only that, but insecurity and that overwhelming sense that the world owed him a favour. When people would later describe Eric, they said that he was the kind of person who was very intense, who gave off like low-key weirdo vibes, and that's just code for, you know, this is the kind of guy that you don't want to be trapped in a small room with, especially if he gets angry, but also just not at all. And before Eric had even developed his delusions that he completely bought into, he wasn't a perfect person. He was someone who constantly demanded control. If you got in a disagreement with this man, he would see that disagreement as disrespect. And this is just typical little Weasley insecure man syndrome, when they can't stand that someone might stick up for themselves against them, might disagree with their Delulu beliefs. And what I wanted to say there, instead of Delulu, was doolally. Scottish word of the day. Doolally means that you're mental, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way against mental illness. It means mental as in rage, like you're a bit crazy, like you could just fight someone at the drop of a hat, those kind of vibes. Doolally. Let me know if you use it in daily life. And this was a kind of man who needed dominance the same way that normal people needed praise. And if he felt insulted by you, you know, whether you said something insulting or not, if he just took it the wrong way, he didn't want an argument. He wanted to punish you. He was someone whose temper wasn't just quick, it was entirely disproportionate. Any inconvenience in his life became a crisis, and any tiny mistake that someone might make, this became betrayal. I mean, honestly, the guys need to take a break and have a Kit Kat, take a chill pill, calm down, climb down from the ceiling. It is not that deep. And then Eric decides, you know what, this instability that I've got, instead of working on it, I'm just going to make it worse. He would throw in his own distorted version of Kindoki. Now, this is a concept of witchcraft that can be found in some Congolese traditions. Now, when Kindoki is practiced culturally, it is quite complex. It has meaning, it has symbolism, it has loads of context, but it was very clear that Eric himself, he didn't understand Kindoki even though he thought he did, and he certainly didn't respect cultural traditions, because what he would do instead is he would use Kindoki as almost like a diagnostic tool for his own paranoia, because of course anyone who annoyed him or challenged him or simply had the misfortune of being around this guy when he was in a bad mood, he would brand them a witch. And this was something he took seriously. I mean, listen, you looked at him the wrong way, he's going to brand you a witch. He was accusing ex-girlfriends of being witches. He was accusing children. He was accusing elderly adults. He even accused some of his neighbours who he had never even spoken to. And at that point, this is not spirituality. This is an ego wearing a costume. It's a deeply insecure little man who is disguising rage as righteousness. Now, when Kristy Bamu and his younger siblings, when they had boarded that Eurostar from Paris to London on December the 19th of 2010, they were so excited. And I mean buzzing with excitement. You could feel it vibrating off of them. It's Christmas time, they're teenagers on this trip together, and they're getting to go and visit their cool, independent, glamorous older sister all the way in London. And Kristy was so excited. He couldn't wait to give his big sister the presents that he had so carefully picked out for her. He wanted to show her how thoughtful he was and how grown up he had become. And if this young boy had felt any nerves at all, it was those normal ones, like the nerves that you get before a big night out or the nerves you get before Christmas when it's actually excitement. These siblings were all so excited to be in Newham. But the minute they stepped through that door to that flat, everything changed immediately. The atmosphere didn't even feel tense. It just felt completely wrong. Now, that flat, it was described as feeling very cramped. And it's not even because the flat was small. It was more because Eric Bikubi, he was taking up all the oxygen. He was a literal oxygen thief. He was there immediately, glaring at them, sizing them up, acting like some kind of overly suspicious bouncer at a nightclub who thinks that his job is the most important job in the world. And you know what it's like when you travel from, I don't know, one place to another. When you meet up with someone, you ask them, how are you? How was your trip? How was the train? How was the plane? Basic chit chat. There's an element of warmth. You want to make sure that the people who are visiting got there safely and got there happily. But when they arrive at the door, Eric just looked irritated. There was no warmth whatsoever. It was immediate tension despite not even knowing them. And Magalie, the person who these children were so excited to see, she wasn't any better. She didn't greet them with this warmth and excitement of an older sibling excited to see her younger siblings. She was guarded, she seemed distracted, she seemed off, she seemed wrong. And the siblings were honestly quite disappointed in the greeting that they had received. I mean, this was a trip they had spoke about for weeks and weeks and weeks that they had planned, and it just wasn't living up to that expectation. So of course, the siblings, they're all very much in tune with each other. I mean, they're so close. Excluding Magalie, of course, she's just turned into a weirdo somewhere along the line. But these siblings, they're exchanging knowing glances with each other. Do you know that kind of glance and glare that teenagers are very much fluent in? I myself used to be fluent in that same glance. The one that says nothing but tells you everything. But the thing is, you need to remember they are far from home. They have a return ticket to Paris, but not for days and days and days. I mean, they're here for the holidays. So they don't want to upset anyone. They don't want to make any waves. So they just try and jolly along and try and lift the mood. Now, it is said that Kristy himself, he in particular went very, very quiet. And it wasn't to be ignorant, it wasn't to cause any hassle, it was simply to try and steady the mood. Remember, this is someone who hates conflict, who never wants to be in arguments with anyone. He just wanted to enjoy the trip, he just wanted to enjoy the time with his family. But Eric, the freak, he takes silence as a reason to be suspicious. So weirdo Eric, he starts scrutinising every aspect of the children's behaviour. A dropped glass, God forbid they giggle, they might whisper to each other, they might even look at each other for reassurance, or they look tired because they were travelling. If they didn't respond to one of Eric's questions quick enough, if they were clumsy, shy, nervous. Basically, if they behaved like normal teenagers, Eric, in his deranged mind, he believed that this was all signs of Kindoki. Even if one of the siblings hesitated when answering one of his questions, because let's be honest, this is the kind of guy that's going to ask questions like they're a frickin' trap, but he would stare at them like he was diagnosing some kind of demon. If they accidentally bumped into a wall or they bumped into the sofa, Eric viewed this as spirit interference. That spirit just pushed them. That spirit's trying to get inside them. And any time that Kristy would become overwhelmed or would go inside himself, Eric didn't see a boy trying to fight. He saw it as this young boy being guilty of witchcraft. Bearing in mind that Kristy was the most emotionally vulnerable child, it was normal for him to react to situations that made him uncomfortable, that made him upset, and this was a monster who was weaponising that against him. This cretin was literally looking at tired teenagers, tired children, and thinking to himself, yep, that's it right there, demonic possession. If ever I've seen it, that's demonic possession. This is basically The Exorcist. We should call them Reagan and Colin Father Karras. And as we all know, delusion needs a leader, but it also needs a follower. Return Magalie. Desperate for Eric's approval, she started mimicking exactly what he was saying. She was watching the kids far too closely, and she would also comment saying that she believed something was wrong with them, especially with Kristy. And very slowly she began assisting Eric's madness. She was literally the hype woman for delusion. So loser Eric, it didn't take him long before he wanted to confront the children about their witchcraft behaviour. So he starts asking them really bizarre questions. Why are your eyes moving like that? Stop lying with your eyes. Why are you whispering? I mean, God forbid you're trying to avoid a weirdo overhearing your conversation about said weirdo. He even straight up asked these children, what spirits have you brought into my house? Tell me. And I'm sorry, but could you imagine being a teenager that's travelled to a foreign place, that, you know, a place that's foreign to you at least, and when you arrive tired, nervous, unsettled, you've got this loser interrogating you about demons, about the way you blink. And of course, the siblings, they denied every single one of Eric's accusations. Rightfully so. They were confused and alarmed and honestly must have been thinking, what the actual f*** is going on here? But what they didn't realise is that denial, this was something that just further enraged Eric. And it fit almost far too neatly into his narrative. And that was that witches will always deny being witches. These children, literally, they couldn't do right for doing wrong. They couldn't explain themselves, but they couldn't admit to being a witch either, because either way, Eric is going to be furious. Now, devastatingly, it would be Kristy's silence that would seal his fate, because Eric took it personally, as if this child being gentle, being a good person, was a direct threat to his authority. And if there is one thing that violent men can't tolerate, it is a soft boy who will not be intimidated into performing fear correctly. Kristy would try to explain himself, he would try to keep the peace. But the more he tried doing this, the more Eric seen possession. Now, once Eric was 100% certain that Kristy was in fact a witch, this home, or, you know, whatever level of home it was before, was now turned into a controlled environment. He was now demanding tests, he was demanding confessions. He demanded that the siblings sit down and expose each other. And I mean, this whole thing is just classic coercive control. Isolate, destabilise, interrogate, and escalate. Now, these tests that the children were being forced into, they were becoming increasingly more humiliating. They were being made to pray out loud, they were being forced to kneel in really awkward positions. They had to repeat phrases, they had to endure freezing cold water, and they also had to try their best to answer these rapid fire accusations without a moment to think. And any mistake that they made in the eyes of Eric and Magalie, this was all used as evidence and could be fatal. Now Magalie, she stood firmly behind Eric. Not once would she come between Eric and her brother. Not once did she ever tell Eric that he was wrong and that she was leaving. Not once did she ask him or beg him to stop. Instead, she began participating. She would watch her brother Kristy's fear with coldness. And it was a coldness that even Eric struggled to match. Like I said earlier, she would even slap her own brother just to show Eric that she aligned with his authority. 3 days before Christmas, these siblings were being punished. By December the 22nd, Kristy's torture had begun. By December the 23rd, he was begging for his life. By December the 24th, he was so beyond injured that he couldn't stand. And by Christmas morning, this young boy would be dead. So let's go to the morning of December the 22nd, and this is when Eric's delusions had almost become a fantasy. It had matured into this fantasy about him being the heroic self-appointed exorcist. And Kristy, he was the centerpiece of the demons, the ones ruining Eric's life. Because, nothing says spiritual awareness than blaming a 15-year-old boy for your unemployment and your insecurity. The siblings at this point, they were barely sleeping and they had no minute to relax or move freely. The minute they woke up would be the minute that Eric would start interrogating them. His eyes darted between the 3 siblings as if he was waiting on one of them sprouting horns and confirming his beliefs. And of course, Kristy, he was nervous, he was exhausted, and he would occasionally look over to his other siblings for some form of reassurance. And Eric seized on this because he believed that Kristy was casting spells with his eyes. And being serious, blinking, glancing, looking around. Suddenly, these are all techniques of witchcraft. And Magalie, she was following every single accusation with an obedient silence or very subtle encouragement. She had even started to echo the words of Eric just to make sure he truly knew that she aligned with him. And the siblings realised that their big sister, the one who they had been so excited to spend time with, the one who they couldn't wait to visit, who they looked up to, who they thought was so cool, she wasn't going to save them. She was now part of the threat. She was no longer that big sister who grew up loving them and caring for them. She was a complete and utter monster. God, I really feel like I'm haunting my own house again with this foundation. So these interrogations, they continue. They're ongoing and they are escalating by the minute. Eric is still demanding with Kristy to tell him what spirits he brought into the home. He was still trying to force these siblings to turn on each other, but their bond was so strong, they completely refused. But again, their refusal to go along with Eric's delusions. He believed they were colluding. Now, as that night fell, things were only getting worse for Kristy and his siblings, especially Kristy though. He was the forefront of their delusional beliefs. He was being slapped, hit, beaten with objects that no child should ever be touched with. Every time he flinched or stumbled or hesitated with a question, he was further accused of witchcraft and further punished. Now that very night, Eric, he had taken away the siblings' beds. He had taken away their comfort, that last bit of safety that they were so desperately clinging on to. They were kept awake all night, forced to stand for long periods of time, and they were interrogated relentlessly. Young Kristy, he begged, he cried, he pleaded, but the more he did this, the more Eric believed it reinforced the demonic resistance. Magalie, her role had hardened at this point. She wasn't just allowing this violence to take place, she was very much in the middle of it. Her little brother would cry out to her. Multiple times he begged for his big sister, hoping that somehow she was still in there. And every single time he was just met with this coldness and callousness that he did not recognise. And his siblings said that betrayal to Kristy, that appeared to hurt him more than the blows he was facing. By the morning of December the 23rd, a new method of torture was introduced in this whole thing, and that was water. Eric would force Kristy into the bathtub. He framed this as the purification process, but all this was, to its very core, was water torture. He had filled the tub all the way up, and he was pushing Kristy's head underneath the surface. He demanded that he confess. He demanded that he confess to witchcraft. Demanded that he admitted to witchcraft. But what this frickin' loser doesn't realise is you cannot admit to jack shit when you are being submerged in a tub of water. Kristy was thrashing, and Eric believed this was because the spirits were resisting. What an idiot. An idiotic, pathetic, Weasley little loser, because this isn't someone resisting spirits. This is someone resisting drowning. Every single time Kristy had the chance to choke for breath, Eric said this was the demons crying out. Magalie stood at the side of this tub and she watched the life drain out of the very baby that she had once cradled. There was breaks in between this drowning because, you know, obviously they want to prolong this torture. But the breaks in between, they weren't really breaks at all because Kristy was constantly being beaten with sticks, with broken ceramic tile, with pliers, anything else within their reach, metal bars, you name it, this young boy was being bet with it. They were using chairs, they were using lamps. Some of these were actually breaking under the force that was being used against Kristy. The pliers that I mentioned, they were used on Kristy's face, they were used on his ears and his fingers, causing injuries that had horrified seasoned investigators. Every grab, every twist, everything that this young boy endured came with the same deranged justification that the spirits must come out. These younger siblings are having to stand back and watch what is happening to Kristy. They are forced to face this. They try and defend him. They try and beg and plead for Eric and Magalie to stop, but every time they begged, they were punished. Eric would accuse them of being witches and telling them that they were going to be next. They were trapped in this psychological nightmare, and nothing they said, nothing they did, it didn't matter. By Christmas Eve, Kristy's body was covered in welts, bruises, lumps. His jaw was clearly damaged, half of his teeth were loosened, some had even snapped off completely. He was becoming weaker as each and every single hour passed. He could barely walk, he could barely breathe. He was crying out not to die. And this wasn't him being dramatic, it wasn't him overreacting, it was because this boy could feel himself slipping away. Now Eric, when he sees the weakness of Kristy and the begging, he sees this as his exorcism working. The spirits are finally starting to leave. His justification, it was delusional, but to him, airtight. Now by the evening of December the 24th, Christmas Eve, a time that should feel special, should be special, you should be with your loved ones, enjoying yourself. But Kristy, he was barely even conscious. He could barely even respond to these questions and interrogations that were still ongoing. This boy wasn't fighting demons, he was literally fighting for breath. And still, even at his weakest, Eric refused to stop. The siblings would later say that Kristy had whispered to them at one point, saying, "I'm going to die, please, I'm going to die." And Eric was just dripping with this sadistic satisfaction and told Kristy that he needed to finish the confession. And then we come to Christmas morning, and this is 3 days into this relentless torture that Kristy is facing. He was so weak on Christmas morning that when he was put in this bathtub, he no longer could resist. In fact, when he was put into this bathtub, it didn't even look so much like he was drowning. He was just sinking. His body literally had nothing else to give. His siblings, they were begging and screaming with Eric, pleading with him to stop. They begged Magalie to intervene. They begged Kristy to hold on. But the pair who were causing this horror, who were causing this terror, trauma and death, they stood firm. They refused to stop. When Kristy's body finally came to a complete halt, when his body was still, Eric stepped back, and it wasn't with horror, but with this empty satisfaction of a man who believes that he is one. And Magalie, she didn't run over to Kristy. She didn't try to intervene or to help, even though it was too goddamn late. She didn't hold him. She didn't weep for her brother. And what is just such an eerie thing to imagine is the siblings are in the bathroom with Eric and Magalie. Kristy's dead body is lying in that bathtub, and in the other room, the Christmas lights are flickering, whilst this 15-year-old boy is lying dead at the very hands of the people that he trusted. By the time that this weaselly excuse of a man, Eric, had stepped away from that bathtub, Kristy was gone. He was 15 years old, he was gentle, he was kind, he wouldn't have hurt a fly. And he was completely destroyed. And it wasn't by witchcraft, not by spirits, not by any paranormal delusion, but by someone who should have fiercely protected him. Now, Magalie and Eric at this point, they're looking at Kristy in the bathtub, and there's not a sense of regret. There is not a regretful, remorseful bone in either of their bodies, but there's a panic. A mechanical panic, a panic of two horrendous human beings, or sorry, excuses for human beings, who suddenly realise they might get in trouble. And, they don't want to get in trouble. They haven't done anything wrong in their eyes, or, as they would try and lead people to believe, they didn't think they did anything wrong, but let's be honest, they knew exactly what they were doing. But they would lift Kristy's lifeless body from the bathtub, place him on a towel on the floor, and they would give chest compressions, but let me tell you, a very half-assed attempt. And it wasn't CPR delivered out of love and remorse or guilt or people who so desperately wanted to bring this boy back so he could live his life. It was out of the fact that they were terrified of the legal consequences. And that right there, that takes away any sort of diminished responsibility that they would try and go after, because quite clearly, you know what you've done wrong. And that is not diminished responsibility. That is knowingly and willingly murdering someone and then realising, shit, I don't want to go to jail, I better try and fix this. Now, when Kristy was not responding to CPR, Eric decides that, now's the time to call an ambulance. Now is the time to try and get help. And this call, again, not out of love, not out of care, he would even try and manipulate the medical staff on the phone. He didn't say, we tortured him, we need help because we've caused this, we've done something terribly wrong. He actually tells the staff on the phone that Kristy was possessed, behaving strangely, before he became unresponsive. And Magalie's in the back and she's like, yeah, Eric, that's what happened. Yeah, he was possessed, he was acting strangely. They then claim that Kristy had drowned himself in the bathtub, as if saying that drowning himself would rewrite the history of the last 3 days that quite clearly evidence torture. When these first responders arrived to that flat on Christmas Day, they were expecting it to be a drunken family feud that's gone terribly wrong. But the moment they open that door, they step into a scene so chaotic, so violent. And several of them had even admitted later that that scene was like nothing that they had ever encountered before. First responders, they had said that this flat, it didn't look lived in, it looked struggled in. There was objects strewn everywhere, furniture, chairs, sticks, metal bars, you name it, it was there. The floor was completely slick with water to the point it was actually getting their socks wet inside their boots. But this wasn't a plumbing leak, this wasn't a problem with the bathtub. It was very clear to see someone had died amongst this. Red streaks went through the water, there was pools of blood, and there was these smears where they could see that someone had clearly been dragged. First responders had said that the air in this flat, it was humid, it was dense, it had this sour smell mixed in with sweat during these struggles. And there was this eerie stillness just hovering over them. And then they spotted the children, Kristy's siblings, they were all clustered together, almost trying to hide themselves up against a wall. You could tell they were so terrified. Some were trembling, some were crying, and their clothes were quite clearly wet. Their arms and legs were also marked with cuts, bruises, scrapes, scratches. They looked exhausted, they looked traumatised, they were too weak to be able to speak. And police officers, they immediately recognised that these children, they're not merely witnesses, they themselves were victims. And then came the sight that no officer would ever be able to forget, and that was Kristy. He was laying on the bathroom floor. His thin body was battered, bruised, broken, destroyed. His limbs were at unnatural angles and his skin was eerily pale. And the officers, they didn't need a medical examiner to tell them that something awful had happened here. The injuries on Kristy himself spoke volumes. The sheer number, the sheer brutality, and the sheer panic in the eyes of the siblings. Eric and Magalie, they start over-explaining themselves. They talk about the demons, they talk about the possession, just all this confused jibber-jabber that the police are like, shut up, like, I don't want to hear this. They were mentioning the evil spirits, the strange behaviour, and it was an insult to anyone with a functioning pulse. And the officers, they cut them off almost immediately because no sane person could look at Kristy's injuries, the way he was left, and say that it was anything other than sheer brutality and violence. Now, thankfully, the police, they separate the adults from the children. They want to speak to the children by themselves. They want to get to the bottom of this, what exactly happened. And the children tell them everything. And one important thing that really stood out is that the child's statements, they all lined up. I mean, they were told differently, they weren't rehearsed, but they all made the same amount of sense. These children were brokenhearted, they were sobbing, they were panicking, they were terrified. They told the police how they were also forced to hurt their brother. They told the police how their older sister had joined in on this brutality and how their brother was murdered in front of them. Medics would attempt to resuscitate Kristy, and his siblings had to watch this from the hallway, hugging on to each other, hoping and praying that maybe he might just come round. But no matter how many times or how hard these paramedics tried, Kristy was gone. After several attempts, they had no choice but to stop, and Kristy's time of death would be called in the middle of that broken torture chamber of a flat, and yet again the Christmas lights were still blinking away in the next room. And as you can probably guess, at this moment in time, Magalie and Eric, they would be arrested, and the 3 other children, they were taken into protective custody. At the mortuary where Kristy's body was taken, the pathologist, who had decades of experience, who had witnessed so much disaster and tragedy, even she had to brace herself for what she was about to find. Because nothing prepares anyone to carry out an autopsy of a child who has been brutalised for 3 days. Now, the moment that examination began, it was clear that Kristy had been a victim of a brutal assault. I mean, visually it was all there. His body was a map of bruises, of welts, of cuts, scrapes, everything. The bruises were in different stages of development. There was cuts of varying depths, there was swelling, abrasions, and areas of complete rawness. His limbs were marked with defensive wounds where he had tried to protect himself and to save himself. When the pathologist was documenting all these different injuries, they concluded with over 100 injuries over this child's body. And each of them had matched the weapons that were found in that flat. The ceramic tile, pliers, a hammer, the walls of the flat. And like I said earlier, the pliers in particular, they had left very distinctive marks on this young boy. His jaw had suffered severe damage. One side showed swelling that was consistent with blunt force impact. This was heavy enough to cause deep-rooted bruising and loosened teeth. Some teeth had been fractured and these weren't cleanly broken off. They were almost jagged manner that suggests force applied during repeated blows rather than one strike. His hands were covered in defensive wounds. It was clear that he had tried to shield his face and his head from both of his attackers. The wounds in his back, they were consistent with being struck whilst he was lying down or kneeling down, and as we know, they were forced to be on their hands and knees. His legs had carried various bruises, and this just documented his attempts to escape, to move, to stand. Every single movement that had been punished. A lot of his wounds were deep enough that it was consistent with repeated blows. There was other ones that were more superficial. They were almost like marks of being dragged across different floor surfaces like carpet, wood, tile. And then they came to examining this young boy's lungs, and that water told no lies. Eric and Magalie could never ever talk their way out of this. There was unmistakable signs of forced submersion. Water had entered his airways and reached very deeply into his lungs. That drowning was described as violent, desperate, the kind of drowning where your body fights, not for long-term survival, but simply for its next breath. And then a detail that was incredibly harrowing for the pathologist and everyone that had to bear witness to the autopsy. This was the fact that Kristy's lungs had showed signs of repeated drowning attempts. His lungs had showed trauma of water inhalation on more than one occasion. This meant that he had been submerged, revived enough to continue suffering, and then submerged again. And if that is not sadistic, evil and cruel and torturous, then I don't know what is. The pathologist had recorded that the cause of death, it wasn't just one of them. It was a multitude. It was drowning. It was the beating. It was his body giving in to physical exhaustion because it couldn't handle anything more. In simpler terms, Kristy didn't die from one injury. He died from all of them. The pathologist had noted that Kristy would have suffered a significant amount of pain in his death. She wrote that his injuries were sustained and severe. She underlined that everything she found pointed not to an impulsive act of violence, but to a prolonged episode of complete brutality that had been inflicted intentionally and over multiple days. Now, when the report reached detectives, it truly became the backbone of the case because no one could argue accidental harm. No one could argue spiritual delusion as justification. And no one could try and convince the court or the investigators or anyone for that matter that they had just snapped in the moment. Because Kristy's wounds spoke for themselves. And that was that 2 adults had tortured this young boy over a series of days, systematically, deliberately, with escalating violence. This report told them just how many chances Magalie had to stop Eric, how many moments Eric had to walk away but refused, how many opportunities had existed for the pair to call for help whilst Kristy was still breathing, and how every single one of those opportunities were completely ignored. As you can imagine, Magalie and Eric, they were suspects from the get-go, especially when they had the testimony from the other children. When they were taken into the interview rooms, they were completely separated, because of course you don't want 2 suspects to weave their lies together and create the perfect little image. And the moment that they were parted, the cracks began to show. Now Eric, he sits down, his body's completely stiff, his arms are crossed. It's almost like he's trying to hold in his confession, like not allowing the truth to escape his body. And it was very clear to police that his whole image, it was flickering between irritation and arrogance. He was genuinely treating the police as though they were an inconvenience to him. When the police ask him to tell his accounts of the events that took place, he starts off with the usual. You know, Kristy was possessed, he was strange, he was acting strange and violent. He was a heroic exorcist, he was the one who dialed 999. He said that Kristy had brought demonic forces into his home and they had to be ridden of. And detectives, they don't interrupt him. They just let him talk and talk and talk, because no one unravels their story better than a man who's so full of his own self, who's too self-serving and proud. I mean, they give them the rope and they hang themselves. The more he explained, the less sense that was made. He insists that him and Magalie were trying to save Kristy, that they were trying to rid him of the evil. He insisted that they had no choice but to carry out these rituals. In the adjoining room, there was Magalie, and she looked smaller than she's ever looked before. But that smallness, it wasn't innocence, it was simply self-preservation at best. She knew what she had done. She knew what she had allowed, and she knew deep down that whatever life she had up until that moment, the moment that Kristy's heart stopped beating, had now ended. When the detectives are questioning her, she clings to Eric's story like it's a raft, like it's the frickin' door in the Titanic and you're Jack just holding on to the edge. She gave the same old spiel that Kristy was possessed, that there was demons in the home, that they had to help him, they had to do rituals to exorcise the demons, blah blah frickin' blah. But see, the thing is, and where Eric gets his merits, is that he was really committed to the cause. You know, he knew what to say for the whole spiritual delusion fantasy thing. Magalie, on the other hand, she didn't have the spiritual conviction. She faltered, she contradicted herself, her timing was completely off. Detectives watched as she tried to feign concern, Like she wanted to make sure her brother was okay, even though he was laying there dead in front of her. She even tried to fake grief. But the thing about grief is that it can't be faked. And whatever Magalie was doing, trust me, wasn't grief. Detectives had allowed them to spill the beans for as long as they needed, kept them talking, kept them contradicting themselves, kept the story unravelling. They'd even spoken to the children, and yet again, every single one of those children's stories completely lined up with what happened to Kristy. They knew they had the murderers in custody, Eric and Magalie. They just wanted one of them to confess first. One of the detectives comes in the room and they place Kristy's autopsy photos in front of Eric. And Eric didn't want to look. His eyes flickered back and forth, back and forth. He couldn't stare at those photos because he knew that what was lying in that photograph wasn't a demon. It was the broken body of a 15-year-old boy who he and Magalie had broken. Eric tries to be his usual delusional, arrogant self, but it quickly crumbles. And suddenly he has to go for a new bit. He tells them that he had lost control, he was overwhelmed in the moment, that everything got out of hand. But the injuries contradicted that, the timeline contradicted that, and most importantly, the children contradicted that. Now Magalie, she had actually broken earlier before Eric, and this was when she was given the children's statements, when she heard what they had said, and when she seen the autopsy photos. She finally admitted that the discipline went too far. I can't believe that she's still trying to use the word discipline to describe this whole monstrous event. And when she was talking to the police, her voice was cracking. But this wasn't because of grief. It wasn't because of what she had done. It was because she was scared of losing the man that she loved. She was scared of the consequences of her own shitty actions. She admitted that she had slapped Kristy. She admitted that she allowed Eric to do whatever he wanted. She said that she believed that Kristy was possessed. She believed every word that came out of Eric's mouth. She admitted that she valued Eric's approval more than she valued the life of her little brother. And I'm sure it comes as absolutely no shock to anyone that both of these defendants, they were formally charged with first-degree murder of a 15-year-old boy. They were also charged with 2 counts of causing bodily harm against Kristy's siblings. Now, before the trial, Eric and Magalie, they undergo psychiatric evaluation to determine whether there was mental illness, whether diminished responsibility could be their defence. Now, the assessments found that Eric himself, he did suffer with certain personality disorders, and it did show paranoid beliefs, especially around witchcraft. But crucially to that, it showed that he knew what he was doing was wrong. He had full awareness of his actions, and his delusion did not remove his responsibility. I mean, I could probably have told you that from the start, and I'm sure you knew it as well. Now, Magalie's assessments, even more straightforward. She didn't suffer from mental illness. She didn't suffer from delusions. She was fully aware of her reality. She was fully capable of stopping the events. And she was fully complicit. Experts had concluded that her obedience to Eric was psychological, not pathological. She participated because she chose to, not because she couldn't resist. Now, the trial would begin in early 2012, and from the moment this trial had started, it just carried this stunned heaviness that no one could believe. Now, of course, the defence, they tried to go with the delusions, the fact that Eric really believed everything that he was saying. He believed Kristy was possessed, XYZ. For Magalie, her defence had said that she was heavily manipulated and that she was coerced into doing everything that Eric told her to. But the issue was, Eric wasn't telling her what to do. The prosecution laid out the details. They spoke about the autopsy, and they explained to the court that this whole ordeal, this evil ordeal, was deliberate, it was calculated, it was prolonged, it was torturous. On March 5th of 2012, after weeks of testimony, after weeks of forensic experts and reviewing Kristy's final hours in horrific detail, the jury reached the only possible conclusion. Both Eric Bikubi and Magalie Bamu, they were found guilty of murder. Eric would be sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years, which, don't even get me started, there shouldn't even be a minimum term, but it's the UK. Magalie was sentenced to life imprisonment also, but her minimum term was 25 years. And although they have minimum terms, I'm hoping and praying that my confidence here is correct. I highly, highly doubt that they will ever see the light of day ever again. And now we come back to Kristy Bamu. Kristy should be remembered for his kindness, his sweetness, and the quiet strength that he showed even in the darkest circumstances. This boy deserved safety and he deserved love. He deserved a full life that he never got the chance to live. So when we say his name, we honour him, not for the way that his life was taken, but for that gentle, joyful boy that he truly was, and the young man that he should still be becoming. Kristy Bamu deserved a lifetime, and the very least that we can all give him now is remembrance. But my loves, that is it for another true crime and makeup episode. I know this one was disturbing. I know it was horrifying, the details that we went into, but I am so thankful and grateful that you stuck around for this video, because with what these victims go through, the least we can do is be uncomfortable for an hour or however long it takes. If you do enjoy my content, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe before you leave this video. Please don't forget to hype the video. It really helps boost me out to the YouTube algorithm. It's so important to help grow in my channel, so it would mean the world to me if you could do that. Any details you need regarding me, myself and I, they will all be found listed down below in the description. Social media handles, products used on my face today. But with all that being said, that is it for today. Please, please, please remember, be a good person. Do not be a bad person. Stay safe. Look after each other. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.